joining us. We're here today to talk about human-wildlife conflict policies. Why are they important? Why do we need them? How do they help? My name is Lisa Faraway. I'm the manager of the Global Wildlife Program at the World Bank. I'm co-moderating this session with Alex Zimmerman, who needs no introduction to any of you, as the face of this conference. And what we're going to do today, we've tried to squeeze as much as we can into this 90 minutes because we had so much talent and interesting people that we wanted to hear from. So we're going to have 2 panel sessions. We'll do a quick changeover of them in between to give you a bit of excitement as you see them rush to the stage. And then we'll hopefully have time for Q&A at the end. So first, some scene setting. So at the Global Wildlife Program, we've been looking into the extent of to which human-wildlife conflict is incorporated into policies. So we did a perception survey of government to say, tell us how you think human-wildlife conflict is affecting your country, your capacities to manage it. We've done an assessment of national biodiversity strategy and action plans, and we've looked at which governments actually have a national human-wildlife conflict policy. And in a way, that was the impetus for this session for us, that we thought this is human-wildlife conflict is underrepresented in policy, and we want to get a bit of attention on that. So that's why we're here today. So I'm going to present some of the initial findings of our rapid analysis of MBSAPs. So most people here probably know what an MBSAP is. But our National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan is a key national strategy for implementation of the Convention on Biological Diversity. This is the document that's meant to help mainstream biodiversity across all different sectors and into a range of policies. So we thought, well, given that we've been talking about human-wildlife conflict is such a cross-sector issue requiring coordination across ministries and sectors, we should look to see to what extent it's included in MBSAPs. So we looked at 182 MBSAPs to see how many of them mention human-wildlife conflict. Pop quiz for the audience. Let's go for some audience participation. How many MBSAPs do you think mention human-wildlife conflict? What percentage of all those MBSAPs we looked at? Anyone have a guess? 10, 20, 12, 50, someone's high. 24%. Whoever said 20, you get the door prize. I don't know that we have anything. Hasita, do we have a door prize? Please see Hasita for your door prize. It may be a page from her notebook or a business card. But we found 24% of MBSAPs mentioned human-wildlife conflict. A lot of them, it's not, big reference. It may be just a fleeting reference, but 24% do mention human-wildlife conflict. And then we looked at the regional breakdown. Second pop quiz, if we looked at Africa, Asia, Europe, and Latin America and the Caribbean, which percentage of those regions do you think had the highest representation of human-wildlife conflict in their MBSAPs? So now I want you to shout out a region to me. Asia, Africa, I'm hearing lots of Africa. Here you go, Africa. So if we then break that down, 39% of MBSAPs for countries in Africa mention human-wildlife conflict, 23% for Europe, 21% for Asia, 17% in Latin America and the Caribbean. We are finalizing this at some point. We will do a report and probably another webinar as we release it. So that's a plug for the GWP webinar when we do it. But these are the first time we're presenting it, so you're getting some initial results. And the other thing we did then, we went, how do they mention it? So Manali and the Global Wildlife Program team and Hasita went through and they laboriously coded all of these references to human-wildlife conflict to see how are they mentioning it and in what context. And this is what we found. So first, we found one of the key ways that human-wildlife conflict was most likely to be included was talking about the fact that human-wildlife conflict is a threat to sectors. And now we're looking at just that 24%. So of those 43 that had it, I think it's 84% of them mentioned that human-wildlife conflict was a threat to a sector. So I think if your maths is better than mine, that's maybe about 40 of the original. And agriculture by far was the most frequently mentioned sector. Second, we looked, are they mentioning human-wildlife conflict as a threat to different stakeholders? Are they talking about the people that are affected by human-wildlife conflict? And I thought this was really interesting. Almost half as many times, stakeholders were mentioned. So MBSAPs were twice as likely to talk about sectors being impacted than they were about stakeholders or people being impacted by human-wildlife conflict. And when they did mention it, smallholder subsistence were the most frequently mentioned stakeholder. Third, we looked at whether human-wildlife conflict was captured in national targets. Not surprisingly, it wasn't captured in any because it wasn't explicitly in any of the Aichi targets. However, we did find that over half of them mentioned human-wildlife conflict in the supporting narrative or actions under other national targets. And this was across a range of targets. So we found that MBSAPs were mentioning actions on human-wildlife conflict linking to national targets on protected area management, species conservation, community awareness. So it was coming in as a cross-cutting issue across MBSAPs. And when we dove deeper into those actions and what are they saying needs to happen, the number one that came up was development of policies and plans, followed by compensation and insurance, education and awareness, and direct prevention measures. But this is the initial findings of what we had. And we're going to dig into this a bit in our first panel, but first I'm going to hand to Alex, and she's going to go through some of the results from the global survey that we did on government perceptions. Alex wears many hats. One of them is that she's a consultant working with the Global Wildlife Program, so she's also wearing her Global Wildlife Program hat. Over to you, Alex.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so as Lisa already explained, we ran this survey just to kind of get an idea for what is the policy landscape or what is the sort of situation with policies and ask government respondents just on their reactions to this topic. And remember, this was done pre-GBF, and we actually sent a questionnaire, an online survey, to all CBD parties. Actually, it was 194 countries, so almost all. 70 of them replied, so just a little over a third of countries replied, and these are the countries that responded. Now, this was sent quite often to the CBD focal point or similar type of position, which means they may not necessarily have been the direct human-wildlife conflict kind of officer person in that government. Very often it was passed on to, it actually said in the invitation, I see some people who actually responded to this in the audience, and thank you. And so this was just to get an idea of the landscape. So I'm just going to run through some of the simple and interesting results. The first is just in terms of how much of a concern it is. So across the board and across regions, definitely it seemed to be a major concern for all of these 70 respondents. And the variation here is not huge, but you can see a slight trend towards Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Well over 50% of the respondents felt that this is a very serious issue in their countries, less so in the European countries. In terms of whether it's an increasing issue, that mirrors the previous result. Yes, definitely predominantly perceived as an increasing issue of concern for those governments in these countries. Again, the African countries in particular, but these are fairly similar results across the board. Now, interestingly, when we look at which species of concerns, this is when you start to see regional differences, which make complete sense. It's the species that are high profile in those regions. So we gave a whole bunch of species, a long list, and you could tick as many as you wanted. And so, not surprisingly, you find that in Latin America, it's the carnivores, it's the jaguars and the pumas predominantly, that are of concern. Jaguar range states is 17 countries. And then in both Asia and Africa, you see the elephants there. Is there a pointer here? Yeah, here we go. As I said this morning, any country that has elephants has a concern about elephants. What is also quite interesting, I thought, is that in the Asian respondent countries, primates rank very high. And not surprising to me, but I think that's a good one to note because we focus so much on the carnivores and the elephants all the time. And there's all these other species, as we've heard a few times this morning as well, that are really a concern to communities, stakeholders, and that therefore are also of concern to governments. And so, in terms of which stakeholders are affected, again, unsurprisingly, this kind of mirrors what are the predominant stakeholders in the region, but across the globe, it's the smallholder communities in particular. And you see the regional breakdown, which is, again, kind of mirrors the situations you have on in these continents. Interestingly, here is the urban-suburban concern in the Latin American countries. That I find quite interesting, actually. In terms of impacts, well, number one, across the world, it's crops. Number two, across the world, it's livestock. And then it's a bunch of other things, including, safety, damage to property, concerns over diseases, and access to resources, and cultural fears. So, if we look at the question of, do you feel, so this is to government respondents, do you feel this issue is being efficiently and well managed in your country? Vast majority said no, surprisingly. And that's, again, particularly, now I actually think that the high response from Latin America is an artifact of the data. The stats suggest that this is just a respondent issue here, but it could be interesting to actually ask the Latin American government reps in the room about that some more. And in terms of resources to address human-wildlife conflict, again, the response was largely, no, we do not have enough resources, except in Europe, where there wasn't so much a concern about a lack of resources, where most of the European respondents felt, yeah, we've got more or less what we need to do, what we need. We're not desperate as much as the other regions. Now, we kind of tried to get a sense of, in terms of all the different biodiversity issues that a government is dealing with, where does this sit, and what are all the different competing priorities and concerns? And also, just specifically on human-wildlife conflict, what are the major challenges from a government perspective? And that was, again, a whole range of things. So it's fairly even distribution across these different challenges. I won't read them all out, but you get a quick sense of it there. Where you allocate your budget, how do you distribute it across the different pressures to allocate limited budget, infrastructure and know-how, technical knowledge, all these sorts of different challenges. There's a lot of things that come into trying to manage this from a whole country, national perspective. Okay, that's just a quick sort of run through to set a bit of a background context. We are going to, do we want any questions right now? Any questions on this so far? Or reactions even, for those who are governments in the room?
So, I just wondered with that top one, it's not surprising that money comes up with issues and it's also an easy one to point to. I just wondered whether, with that statement, is it something internal where the respondents are saying it's difficult trying to get the money out of somewhere else of government and make this thing a priority within government? Or, what is it that's sort of behind that statement? Is it about seeing this as a priority internally within government for funding that is making it difficult? Or are they just saying there just isn't enough money?
Jamie, that's a super, super good question, because So this was the questionnaire. It was a structured, mostly closed question methodology. So the why behind it was not explored in this data set. However, this is one of the questions I have for one of our panelists in just a minute, and I would like to hear about exactly what are the competing priorities and how to juggle those.
Thank you.
So thanks. Do we have time for a few more? Two more quick questions, and then we'll move on. Over here, Pat.
Thank you. I was a little surprised to find that Asia and the Pacific, they also have sufficient resources to address HWC. I mean, it's on a par with Europe. That's interesting.
I was surprised about that too.
Has that been, I mean, in capturing statistics, has that been consistent, or is this?
So the stats behind this show, there's a marginal significance here.
Okay.
This is really to give us a general impression, but we have quite a few people who might be able to comment on this, actually. Okay, I'll take one more quick one, and then we're going to talk to our panelists.
Yeah, thank you. My question is very quick and very simple. Is that published somewhere?
Not
Because
yet.
that would be very useful for me to cite.
Not yet, will be.
It will be. Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, great. So with us today we have, I'm going to start with Silmira da Silva. Silmira is Director General of National Administration of Conservation Areas in Mozambique. And prior to that, she also served as Executive Secretary for the National Council of Food and Nutrition Security for 2 years. And Silmira is going to talk to us a little bit about these issues in Mozambique. And Silmira, I'd like to ask you, for example, in Mozambique, which has human-wildlife conflict in its NBSAP, and you have a policy on human-wildlife conflict. Let's have a little sort of reflection on Jamie's question there. How do you pitch this issue, which compared, you've got many, many issues in biodiversity, climate, all sorts to juggle. How do you get it prioritized in the national biodiversity agenda?
Good afternoon, everyone. Dear panelists, distinct participants and invitees, I would like, first of all, to thank GWP, Lisa, and all team to invite us for this important session to share our experience in Mozambique on human-wildlife conflict. We have 25%, 26% of our territory in conservation area, in terrestrial, and about 12% in marine conservation areas. So we have this large portion with the rapid expansion of urban footprint, demographic growth, and also the fauna population is growing very rapidly based on the conservation efforts that we are doing in our parks and reserves. So looking at human-wildlife conflict, I would like to say that we have a strategy, and the strategy is focusing first of all in the land use plan and wildlife corridor establishment. The most important thing for us is looking at our ecosystem and how the animals move, because we have limits, all parks with limits, but the animals, they go out because of season reasons and other important ecosystem and the corridors that they take. So we have some measures that we are using in our country. First of all is the translocation of problematic animals. Normally we used to move those animals to other places. Obviously we are creating two benefits. First of all is preventing more conflicts and restoring other conservation areas. Other important issues, resettlement of the community. We have voluntary resettlement, and also sometimes we need to move people from the conservation area and redesign our maps, focusing on the corridors. Because now people are asking, we would like to know what are the corridors outside the parks and what are the season those animals move, because they want to know just to avoid any kind of conflicts. Nowadays, we can find animals in a place that we didn't. It's not usual, also because of climate change, which are degrading the landscape. Another important measure that we take, but this is the last option, and according to the law, the DG for Wildlife should authorize, is a culling where it is needed. And personally, we don't use to go straightly to this decision, because we don't want the community to associate a conflict with culling. So what we do normally is move the animal just to avoid this relation. They cannot think that if there is a conflict, immediately they will have protein or meat, if you want to be more specific. So we do everything to avoid any kind of culling in the community. So and another important issue is the forest law, which is under revision now and was already submitted to the Ministers' Council, because we would like to better management of the forest and to make sure that all those corridors are kept. Finally, related to the strategy, our government decided last week to create a scientific committee which would deal with issues of the climate change. You know that Mozambique is exposed to cyclones, to floods every year. Now we still have floods in the country. So it's now time to discuss more about and take actions. The places where we had, for instance, rivers or we have water, if there is any construction should be destroyed, just to make sure that those wetlands should be protected. And we were asked by the government to send a list of more areas that should be protected. So for us, we are happy because we still have more areas, wetlands, where animals move. So for us, we are happy, and we will send the list, which is a list for more than 50 places, Francisca, if you confirm, 50 places, different places all over the countries, just to make sure that we keep the animals safe. Because the human-wildlife conflict is about ecosystem assessment. It's not about the parks and the limits, but the ecosystem. And we can find the ecosystem, for instance, from one side of the country to other side of the country, and the park is in the middle. So the animals move to other places. So it's important to focus on ecosystem studies and to make sure that they move time to time. Just to give you an example, I was in the Gorongosa National Park last week, and there is a flood. The lake inside the park has now eight times more bigger than it is. And we did not see animals unless hippos and crocodiles. So I asked, where are the animals? Because Gorongosa is full of animals. They said, oh, the animals, they know the weather very well. So weeks before, they moved to another place. So they are not there. No damage, no problems with the water, because they moved already. They are in a secure place. So the ecosystem study is very important when you talk about human-wildlife conflict, and also to think about the people when the people move to that place, because the animals were there already. If you go to I used to say the communities that if you go to the Bible at the Genesis, says that animals, everything God created. So we were the last. So we formed them there. So we should know how to deal with them. We formed them there. So based on ecosystem, we will find obviously tools to see how they can move and how we can manage people inside the conservation areas. The other important thing is related to the risk. This is the way our strategy is taking us. The risk is just to make us understand why an incident occurred and under what circumstances, and to redesign the measures of preparedness. Most of the cases, it's not just because the animals came and killed people. Some of the time there is resistance, exposure of the risk from the people's sides. So the risk is a combination of exposure, vulnerability, coping capacity, which determines the severity and probability of an incident. So we need to educate more people about the risk itself, because the animals are there, we are collaring them, we have LDE collars, we have all those faces, move faces, we have those reflectors, and also the community they have capacity to deal with this. But as much as population grows, the capacity, and if the parks are not very large enough, so the capacity of deal with this issue is becoming less. And another important data is that the people and the animals, they are competing from the same source of life, which is water. So people are going to farming near the river, and the elephants and animals goes to drink in the river. So they find fresh maize, and they destroy, they eat everything. So we find people every day talking to us, and as DG for Wildlife, I can tell you that this institution seems like a police station every day because of the conflicts, and the people say, you defend animals, what about ourselves? So how we can deal with this? So just to tell that we can go deep in the management framework related to the risk. First is the preparation. Second is response, how we respond. When there is an incident, which sometimes we have death, unfortunately, and the restoration itself is another phase, and the mitigation of the risk. So we, as government, we no longer discuss the human-wildlife conflict as just the measures that we are, okay, is a combination. We have measures there, but day by day, we need also to discuss the risk management, data management, early warning system about the conflicts that we have in our conservation areas. But most important thing, to educate people. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Samir. Fascinating to hear all these competing pressures and so many things coming together. We'll see if we have time for questions at the end. I'm going to move along to our next panelist, Kostum Sharma, who's also a member of the IUCN Specialist Group on Human-Wildlife Conflict. And Kostum is the Director of Science and Conservation at the Snow Leopard Trust, and also the International Coordinator for the Global Snow Leopard and Ecosystem Protection Program. Kostum, I want to ask you about, so snow leopards range across 12 countries. I got that right. And we noticed in our survey that actually Bhutan, India, and Nepal are three of the countries in that range that have specific human-wildlife conflict strategies. And so the other countries, of course, have policy instruments on dealing with these transboundaries, but they're not. So, because we were looking at MBSAPs and classic policies, but what are the other instruments that you, in your experience, have found? And just tell us a little bit about how that works.
Thank you, Alexandra. And first of all, thank you for inviting me to this panel. And second of all, I'm glad I could make it just in time. But to answer to your question, I think to begin with, harmony or lack of it between strategies within and between countries is not something very new. And But then this is also where, there's a lot of opportunity. And I'd like to cite a very interesting example where about five or 6 years ago, we had a meeting of senior officials from all the 12 snow leopard range countries. We do have 2 senior officials sitting here from India, for instance. And they were discussing a declaration on snow leopard conservation. At one point, the delegate from India, the then delegate from India, he made a proposal to be included or to be discussed for the declaration. And the delegate from Pakistan seconded it. The delegates from Russia and China supported it. All of this happened within 30 seconds. Now, I don't know which other universe things like this happen between these countries, and we all know some of these countries do have difficult relationships with each other. But there is that convening power, there is that harmonizing ability in some of these iconic species that it brings in. Now, while it is encouraging that Bhutan, India, and Nepal have specific strategies for human-wildlife conflict in their NBSAPs, what we need to also understand is that many countries may not necessarily have specified it in their NBSAPs, but they do have human-wildlife conflict happening. Some of them have science-based policies. Some of them have legacy policies. For instance, in some of the countries, hunting wolves is incentivized, and anybody can go out and hunt wolves, and they get $100 when they kill wolves. In other countries, mass poisoning of marmots is supported. In other places, they spray weedicides to get rid of certain native plants just because they're considered to be a problem species for the grazing pastures. So I think, and of course, I didn't mention the better strategies, but I think what we do have is, and this is where programs which are more focused on and have a smaller interest, like the Global Snow Leopard and Ecosystem Protection Program, quite a mouthful. The acronym is not fun either. GSLEP is how we call it. But yeah, whatever. Now this program facilitates dialogue, it facilitates information exchange and knowledge generation through collaboration between scientists, conservationists, and the governments. It has allowed consolidation of strategic priorities from various vehicles, and that's what one can see, that even though some of these human-wildlife conflicts may not be identified as priority in the NBSAPs, if you look at the GSLEP document, which has been endorsed and approved by each of the range countries' governments, they do highlight human-wildlife conflict as one of the key reasons for, or one of the key threats for snow leopards. In fact, not just a key threat for snow leopards, it's also considered to be a primary driver for human-wildlife trafficking, for illegal wildlife trafficking as well. So I think that's where, one probably what one may benefit is just going a little wider and trying to consolidate these from various other vehicles. And one example I'll just quote here, which is again, quite remarkable. I don't remember which of the countries, but I think it was Bhutan or Nepal. They requested the GSLEP Secretariat. Actually, they didn't request, they instructed the GSLEP Secretariat to bring together experts to come up with advisory on how to deal with unusual encounters with snow leopards. Now, in some countries, they have rescue and rehabilitation centers. In some countries, they don't. But it's often pretty lucrative where you have a rehabilitation center to immediately catch an animal, put it in a rehab center, or release it elsewhere. Many times, especially with big cats, and there are classic examples with even common leopards, there are examples with snow leopards, that it doesn't work. The animal comes back, or you end up shifting the problem rather than creating any sort of a benefit. So rather than one community facing the brunt, then now you have multiple communities that are facing the brunt. So, but then there are certain situations, as our esteemed delegate mentioned, when you have to take action. So I think what it allowed us to do was bring in expertise from various parts of the world, create an advisory for unusual encounters on with snow leopards, and primarily those unusual encounters are human-wildlife conflict issues. And that advisory was endorsed by these countries, and I'm very pleased to say Government of India, we have Rageshji and Rameshji here who can talk more about it, but Government of India, Nepal, Mongolia, Pakistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Bhutan have formally imbibed it in their local policies. So even though it's not there as part of their other other NBSAPs and other things, but they do have their internal different vehicles through which they talk about this. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks so much. By the way, I really like your terminology of unusual encounters with snow leopards. I was thinking about, there's so much debate about, do we call it interactions, coexistence, conflict, maybe unusual encounters is a good new one. Thank you for that. Now, joining us as well is Greta Yori, who's also a specialist group member of the IUCN Human Wildlife Conflict Specialist Group. Greta has a lot of expertise in wildlife crime as well as human wildlife conflict, and is currently the Director of Program Development in the Elephant Protection Initiative Foundation, and has a really great overview of the African range states dealing with the African elephant range states and their challenges with HEC. So I would like to ask you, at COP15, the EPI member states adopted a statement on human-elephant conflict. And what are your reflections since then on how this came about? How has it shifted so much at the very highest level that now you're seeing HEC as a top priority in many of these countries? And just tell us a little bit about your experience on that.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you for having me share these views with everyone here today. I think, we've heard today in different formats that, since the dawn of time, we've either coexisted or faced conflict, irrespective of where you are. Where wildlife species are, it's a spectrum between conflict and coexistence. But conflict, to the degree that we're seeing today, hasn't happened overnight. It's really kind of underpinned by our global capitalized system and consumer-driven systems, and the consequences of large human expansion, agriculture expansion, industrial growth, and these pressures on our environment. But it isn't the same over an entire continent. For example, those who might have been raised in Botswana or Kenya, where wildlife is abundant, and interacting with that wildlife is very common. In countries like mine, in Ethiopia, where when I was in my teens, there was already 62 million inhabitants, and now there's double that, 120 million people. So the minority was actually the wildlife, but yet the conflict has only been increasing. So how is that possible? The uncomfortable truth is that a lot of what we talk about at this conference is underpinned by the social inequality that is perpetuated by unequal access to that natural resource. And those frontline defenders, local communities, and governments that are dealing with that problem see that every day, because for a very long time, land rights, displacement, exclusion of communities, and even within conservation, this was not talked about. Only recently are we starting to recognize that truth. But it isn't something that those on the front lines just came to know now. It's just come out to the global audience that this is what people are facing. And it goes back again to the social, political, economic, historical, indigenous realities that are very varied depending on who you are and where you live. And then couple that with the devastating impacts that we're seeing because of climate change. We're already seeing altering rainfall patterns, completely changing habitats and fodder and availability of food and water, both for people and for elephants. And then additionally, there's armed conflict and displacement of people because of political turmoil, which is continuously pushing people and wildlife into these smaller places, as DG Samira very well described. It's extremely complex. So over the decade that I've been working across the continent in 22 African elephant ranges, we've been hearing about this the last decade. But the focus of funders was, as it was a crisis, was the illegal wildlife trade, the illegal ivory trade, poaching was considered a crisis. But it's something that we have realized more and more is becoming an election issue for governments. You know, when governments are not seen to deal with what the people are facing and the struggles that they're facing, it costs politicians their jobs. So they started changing their attitudes. They said, we have to make this a priority because every time that we're lobbying, this is coming up. And then the pandemic also added the layer of recognizing that the volatility of wildlife economies. Up until the pandemic, tourism income and tourism as a strategy for financing conservation and biodiversity, it was considered a bulletproof solution. And anyone that challenged that notion or was wary of it was anti-conservation. But rather, what we were talking about was in countries like ours, where wildlife economies were never the bulletproof solution because we'd never seen income. A lot of those protected areas were paper parks. Nobody was paying or nobody was benefiting from those protected areas. So we always challenged them, but the pandemic made that a stark reality for the funders and donors and the globe. So governments realized very quickly that if we don't start dealing with the root causes, we were just going to be forever putting out fires, but the fire will one day just engulf everyone and we will burn out. And so the harsh truth is that leaders are being pulled in a million directions. For us in these conferences, wildlife and the environment and that conflict is a priority because we are experts in that space. But, you know, the very highest level of leaders, they've got humanitarian crisis, public health crises, post-pandemic, collapsing economies, conflict, armed conflict. And so in a world where money is the way that we make our life, commodifying the land means it's the only way that they can provide income and feed mouths that require feeding. So we started having these conversations behind closed doors where we started discussing, you know, how can we deal with both? You know, it's an urgent crisis. So in the meantime, we need to prevent fatality. We need to make sure elephants and people are not dying. But also we need to start building ways and carving those paths of discussing how do we stop pushing each other into these tipping points. We need to look at the root causes and center social justice, which has long been ignored, not just the last couple of years, but for decades, and also cultivate solidarity-based systems that truly center wildlife and people.
Thanks, Greta. I want to, at this point, ask if, I have more questions for you, but you give very, very thorough, wonderful answers, and I want to just throw it out there as well, because I know that we have a number of people who are working in different governments in the audience, and I would just want to check if anybody would like to throw in some comments or questions or experiences. Yep, at the back.
Thank you so much for the presentations, Alex and Lisa and everybody else from the Global Wildlife Program. In your chart on the priorities or the lack of priorities, number one is budget allocation. And at the bottom is policies, legal instruments, or political will. And I wonder if that separation is an artifact of the way the questions were asked or the way the NBSAPs were written, because at least in many democratic countries where there are three branches of government, the decisions of funding comes exactly from Congress, from the legislature. So I wonder if we should actually engage more with policymakers, the actual legislatures, where at least in many countries that I know of, comes the budget not precisely for human-wildlife conflict, but the budget for the environment as a whole.
Thanks so much, Jaime. I'm going to turn that question to, would any of you like to comment on that? No? Yeah? I disagree. Jump in if you like. No? Okay. But I would just like to say that I think it is very important to engage with policymakers, and that's partly why we're having in this conference a multi-sectoral. This is a very deliberate attempt to try and bring the researchers, the practitioners, the governments together. And so maybe it's the beginning of more of that kind of dialogue. Okay, yes, please.
So it's absolutely true. So one of the pillars at the EPI, which is when dealing with something as colossal as human-elephant conflict that really underpins every intersection of society, you know, livelihoods, economy, people's lives, we recognize that high-level dialogue and kind of destigmatizing the space where we start challenging the systems that we uphold. This is things like funders, you know, sometimes funders have such an unrealistic understanding of how things play out in the ground. And one of the pillars in our strategy is creating the safe space for governments who often have to remain so diplomatic, but can't look at their funders or their allies in the global north and say, listen, if you're telling me to not commodify this landscape or not cull elephants, how else am I going to make money? If GDP is the way that we measure how well we're doing in this society, then what is the alternative? And that is something that we're spearheading, because we recognize that policy needs to be based on lived reality, not on academia, not on what works in a container system, but what is happening in the real world in the very nuanced way that it's happening. Because it's also very, very surface to think that what might work in a country like Botswana that has a lot of elephants, but only 2 million people, would work in a country like mine where there's 120 million turning into 150 million in the next 20 years, and we have less than 2,000 elephants. But yet any pocket of elephants that in the country is considered a pest or a problem. So I think honoring that disagreements and conflicts is going to be the baseline, but still finding ways to dialogue through that. I think egos and divisive narratives need to stop immediately, because otherwise we won't move forward. I think understanding that there's a huge lack of capacity at institutional government level, and investing in that, not thinking, oh, but the corruption and the greed. Well, working through that, we're going to have to make sure that capacity is raised within the country's ability, because those are the people who make the decisions. Funding needs to recognize the dysfunction of the systems that we're upholding. We can't be asked to find receipts for every penny in failed states or areas where people don't have receipts. These are the things that we're trying to challenge, and also cooperation and honoring whole truths. So what I mean by whole truths is, you know, different ways of knowing, systems of knowledge that are not recognized today in the way policies are made. So who defines science? You know, if it's the people on the front lines that don't have an academic degree, why aren't they not included in policy making when they're the ones that have to face that reality? And finally, gender norms and representation, which is often not understood at a policy level. So yeah, I hope that helps.
Thanks, Greta. I see lots more hands, but I would like to also, Samira, you wanted to reply as well.
Yes, thank you. Just to add that the issue of budget is not just looking at allocation, but as government, because we have all structure until the grassroots level, the important thing is the integrating in putting this kind of issue in the agenda. Our head of state is a champion in conservation, and has a lot of prizes and honoris causa. Is it Dr. honoris causa? Is it? Yes, is recognized as a person who really loves conservation. We are lucky. But in our country, what we have, for instance, I can give you an example for biodiversity law. which we deal with law enforcement and all issues related to the poaching in the conservation areas. What we have a law, but under this law we have a coordinating group, which we have national attorney, police, investigation police, Interpol, justice, everyone. So we do not say people that we should have specific budgets. We involve everyone. We train everyone in the group, and also we have a budget program from USAID. We have everyone involved. So we do not have, for instance, court in a park. We don't have anyone with which is arrested with the crime, wildlife crime, for instance, is immediately judged. It's in any normal court, because we're able to do that. So they train themselves. They are all, everything is integrated as a chain. So I think that in human wildlife conflict is the same. When we go to a meeting with people for all levels, what we say, it's your responsibility to respond. So they don't no longer come to us say, your elephants are disturbing us, because they are leaders there. They should deal with that. So the most important thing we see is the tolerance. They don't kill. They just get panic and try to call the local government or structure at the grassroots level, and then try to solve. But the people are not aggressive with animals. I can give you just a quick example, looking at the time, that we have a small hippo. Hippo is small, 2 tons, but there's a hippo. Suddenly in Maputo Bay, can you imagine, it's a sea, and the hippo was there. So there was a panic for last days of last year. So we did a press release saying there's a small hippo and it's not aggressive. So we will monitor until it returns to the river. And the hunters was already there. Say, Madam DG, we are here, we are ready. Anytime you say shoot, we'll shoot. They say, stop, you can't do that. Other people were completely nervous. Say, why don't you shoot and give people meat? It's the end of the year, so it can be really a festival. We said, no. The people stayed there for 1 week, and the hippo was going and come back. Going and come back. At the evening, coming out to eat and go back again. Because it was difficult to manage, because in the sea, to take to the river, it could, for instance, die. So we decided to continue. I coordinate a very large group with different kind of police, marine, police, all, and they were just sitting there for days and days watching that hippo, until the day the hippo decided to go. 3 days later, came again. It was because the river was flashing water. It was separated from the mother. So it was not able to come back because the water from the river was coming into the sea. So, and one day suddenly, he disappeared. He went back. So, and the people are happy because of the approach. So the tolerance is important, and everyone, each level should budgeting in their own budget. This is an integrated approach that I would like to propose. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that wonderful story as well. I think that we might need to wrap up this round, yes? So that we can keep to time, because we have another 3 panelists joining from 3 completely different countries, which I think will be super interesting to hear. So I would like to thank Selmira Kostub and Greta for their wisdoms and sharing your insights, and let's give them some applause.
And now we're going to do a quick changeover of our panelists, bring up the second panel. This is bringing up the energy. It's after 5 p.m. now, so we'll invite up our second panel. So on this second panel, we're going to talk about national strategies for human-wildlife conflict. And this is the final pop quiz for the day. We also looked into how many countries have a national human-wildlife conflict policy or strategy. How many do you think we could easily find? It's higher than 1. Any other guesses? I think we found around 7 or 8. I think our guess is that there were fewer of 10 out there. I'm going to say if you have one, come and talk to Hasita and make sure you're on our list. We're sure there might be some we're not aware of, but we did a pretty extensive search. We linked it into the survey we did of governments to say if you have a policy, tell us about it. And we found 8, I think it was, a couple more under development. As you saw in the MBSAP assessment, one of the key actions was development of human-wildlife conflict policies. So you are in for a treat today, because this talent sitting here, we have 3 countries that have human-wildlife conflict policies or are developing. I'm going to introduce the panel all at once. So first, in the middle, we're going to hear from Rakesh Jagenia, who is the Deputy Inspector General of Forest Wildlife at the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change in India. He's played a key role in the development of India's National Human-Wildlife Conflict Strategy and was on the National Technical Working Group. Then we're going to hear on the far end from Richard Fryer, Control Warden for Human-Wildlife Conflict Management and Conservation Hunting at the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Tourism in Namibia. And he brings varied experience to this role. He's also worked in the private sector and as a journalist. And finally, we're going to finish sitting close to me in North America. We're going to finish in Canada with Steve Michel, who's the National Human-Wildlife Conflict and Coexistence Management Officer at Parks Canada. And he's worked in Canada's protected area system for 28 years, and he's currently responsible for developing their national human-wildlife conflict policy. So we're going to try and fit in 2 rounds of questions each. We're going to try and be quick because these people, I hear there's a reception tonight, so we have to try and get them out on time, and I think they're going to have questions for you. So I'm going to start with Rakesh. So I don't know if anyone here has looked at India's National Human-Wildlife Conflict Strategy and Action Plan. It was launched in 2021, I think. This is an impressive document. Like, I'm going to sound a bit like a policy nerd here. But, you know, I was impressed, and then I got to the annexes. And the annexes are incredible, the amount of information in there. And the initial phase, it really tries to set out to create an enabling framework for improved coordination and capacity across different layers of government. So my question to Rakesh is, how is this human-wildlife conflict policy helping support institutional coordination and action across different levels of government in India on human-wildlife conflict? So over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. Let me begin by saying that India's conservation efforts dates back to prehistoric times, and after a point of dip in wildlife conservation, we again started fresh, and with Wildlife Protection Act law and various other conservation initiatives taken by Government of India like Project Tiger, Project Lion, etc. We have been able to sustain a good and viable population of tigers, leopards, Asiatic lions, snow leopard, rhinoceros. And with those, we also had started experiencing negative interactions, or in the words of Kostub, unusual encounters. So, but over the last 2.5 years or so, Government of India has brought about a lot of policy interventions, and you know, India is a federal structure of government, so we had issued advisories, we have issued guidelines. Then we also brought about the National Human Wildlife Strategy and Action Plan for the period of 2021 to 26. And recently, 10 days ago, we released species-specific guidelines for about 14 species, as well as guidelines for the media interactions and how to deal with media and various other policy issues. So we have dealt with human-wildlife conflict and coexistence issues with a 5-pronged strategy. These are administrative. Then we also issued guidelines regarding managerial for the people who are actually on the ground. We have brought about clarity in legal provisions. Then we have also issued guidelines for financial aspects of dealing with human-wildlife conflict. And at the same time, we also chipped in technological interventions when we deal with human-wildlife conflicts. So, coming to the kind of achievements which we have had is, first and foremost, to bring in confidence within the local communities, the people who are there, empowering the local Panchayati Raj institutions by bringing in clarity about dealing with the human-wildlife conflicts, as well as the clarity about the provisions which are existing in the Wildlife Protection Act in India. So, as you know, Wildlife Protection Act of India is quite robust. We have prohibited hunting, particularly the pleasure hunting. We do allow hunting for special purposes, for the purposes of scientific management, and also for the purpose of dealing with human-wildlife conflict issues under the Wildlife Protection Act. So this strategy has brought about more clarity among the people who are dealing actually with the human-wildlife conflict mitigation measures, and also brought about empowerment of the local Panchayati Raj institutions. Because the already existing powers in the Wildlife Protection Act have been delegated in some of the provinces in India to the Panchayati Raj institutions. So then, regarding financial aspects, we have brought about technological interventions. We have made the payment of online compensation online. Timely payment of ex gratia with regard to when there are injuries, when there are deaths, when there are crop damages, damage to property. And then we have also brought about an advisory wherein about 25% to 50% of the ex gratia payment in case of death has to be paid online immediately with whatever fund is available with the particular local manager at the ground. So this has helped tremendously, bringing in confidence with the forest department and park managers. Then we have also, as I said, that it has created a lot of awareness among the public, better coordinations. We have envisaged committees at the district level as well as the state level who regularly monitor. These committees comprise of not only just officials from the forest department, these committees also comprise of officials from the police department, officials from the revenue department, officials from the agriculture department, and officials from other line ministries who deal with, who come across these rural development, infrastructure development in the villages on the fringes of forest and wildlife protected areas. So these kind of coordination has helped a lot. Now, whenever there is a kind of ex gratia payment involved in case of crop damage, there is a committee. So the committee goes there. In that committee, there is agriculture officer who goes and assesses the kind of crop damage it has taken place. There is a revenue officer in that committee who goes and checks the credentials of the person who is making the claim. Then there is a forest range officer who goes to the field and he assesses what wild animal was involved in the damage. So this has brought about a good coordination. Then the use of technological interventions, we use GIS technology to map hotspots, and then with hotspot mapping, we can actually pinpoint where our managerial intervention should be. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rakesh. And there, I think you touched on a couple of things that sound simple, but are so important, like clarity on what roles and responsibilities different layers of government may have, and you know, the value of committees in actually supporting effective decision making. And I do have one quick follow-up for you, Rakesh, which is, so one of the things that India National Strategy is doing, it's also kind of setting out a structure for having a human-wildlife conflict strategy in every state and in every district. So this is what's being rolled out now. And I imagine some of you may be thinking, how on earth are you going to finance all of that and finance all of the actions in the plan? And so my question for you, Rakesh, is what approaches is India pursuing to finance implementation of the National Human-Wildlife Conflict Strategy and then the supporting plans at state and district level?
We have schemes at the Government of India level, we have schemes at the state government level, and from there the fundings of all these initiatives, all these policy interventions come. So at the Government of India level, we have centrally sponsored a scheme which we call as Integrated Development of Wildlife Habitats. So in that we fund Project Tiger, we fund Project Elephant, and we also fund development of wildlife habitat, in which we provide funding for conservation and management interventions for all the protected areas we have in the country. Apart from funding for conservation, we also fund under this scheme for human-wildlife conflicts or conservation of wildlife outside the protected areas, apart from species-specific recovery programs. So we have enough funding sources available with us, and we fund the state governments based on the annual plan of operations they submit with us. So they include all these policy directives or action plans in their annual plan of operations, and the Government of India provides funding. It is sharing basis. So states also pool some money, and Government of India also pools money for funding all these interventions. Apart from that, we have Compensatory Afforestation Act. So we have CAMPA fund, we call it as CAMPA fund. So whenever there is diversion of forest areas, there is a percentage, net present value of the forest, which is charged from the user agency who is bringing about the development project in the forest area, and 10% of that funding is utilized for human wildlife or for wildlife management issues. Then we have also tried to popularize the National Disaster Management Act. And we have tried to encourage the states to include human-wildlife conflict in the list of disasters that can be funded. So there, the funding directly comes from the Revenue Department, or the district administrations provide funding for various activities which are there for state disaster, for relief fund, particularly the ex gratia payments. So these are the sources available with Government of India and the provincial governments to prepare annual plan of operations and submit, and funding is available.
Thank you, Rakesh. Everyone, let's give a round of applause to Rakesh. And I love this final one. You know, part of it is seeing how you can integrate human-wildlife conflict into a range of government programs, right? So the one on disasters. I wrote it down and I thought, well, that's neat. So now we're going to go from India to Namibia, and we're going to ask Richard a few questions. So Namibia is on its revised human-wildlife conflict strategy from 2018 to 2027, I think. But Richard, one of the things I find interesting about Namibia's strategy is the strong foundational principles that it's built on, one of which I think is recognizing that human-wildlife conflict is bound to occur when people and wildlife come together, so it's about managing it. But it's also got principles of self-reliance, and that while government may take a leading role, all citizens have responsibility to manage human-wildlife conflict. So Richard, my question for you is, how does the policy support this shared ownership and responsibility across a range of stakeholders? Over to you.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon to everybody. So Namibia has adopted a number of innovative approaches to achieve biodiversity conservation over the years. Due to the commitment and shown by all Namibians, there's been a remarkable recovery and increase of wildlife populations over the years. But obviously with increased wildlife populations, you know, the expanded ranges and so forth, you know, this results in more frequent conflicts between people and wildlife. Governments recognize that, you know, conflicts has always existed, and where people and wildlife live together, and will continue to do so, meaning that it's impossible to eradicate human-wildlife conflict in Namibia, and I speak for the rest of the world as well. All conflict has to be managed and in the most effective and efficient way possible. It's for these purposes that the National Policy on Human-Wildlife Conflict Management was developed in 2009. These policies run our policies run for a period of 8 years, and then we review them again. Obviously, which recognizes the rights of local communities, and also the same to achieve, you know, the biodiversity conservation, which is the ultimate goal at the end of the day. The current policy mentions 12 strategies. I'm not going to go into all the details of all 12 strategies, but I want to just mention a couple that is, you know, that is of real importance to us. One of these strategies in order to reduce human-wildlife conflict is research and monitoring. Basically what that means is research and monitoring to determine when, what, how many, and so forth. Research and monitoring, you know, to identify hotspots, you know, which animals are the most problem-causing animals, which, you know, how many livestock is being attacked, and so forth. So that's one of the strategies. The second strategy that I want to talk about is capacity building within the ministry and the community when it comes to human-wildlife conflict. Capacity in the sense of we need to train people, we need to engage with communities, we need to build the capacity within all these sectors to address human-wildlife conflict. It's impossible for the ministry to address human-wildlife conflict on their own. It's impossible. We have to have, you know, community involvement as well. So we need to capacitate the people. The other one, community care and engagement. This is another form of addressing human-wildlife conflict by the establishment of conservancies and so forth. By doing this, you're giving people basically the right over their own wildlife for which they can generate income and so forth. The other one is removal of problem animals, and there's two ways that we do this. We can either use the strategy of translocating animals, but this is always not very effective. Translocation, you know, when it comes to elephant, where do we take them? We don't know where to take them. We've got too many, and people are already up in arms. Secondly, with regards to lions, where do we take them? Again, we don't have space for these lions, and we also found over the years of experience, you know, you remove lions that move out of Etosha and go and catch livestock in areas adjacent to the park. You move them 200 kilometers away, 3 days later they're back on the same spot. So translocation, yes, we do it at times, but it is not always effective. Our second option is the destruction of problem animals, and I know this is not always, doesn't go always down very well with people, but destruction of problem animals, especially when it comes to repeat offenders and so forth. You know, lions that keep on moving out of the park, causing elephants. But in that case, we really try to identify the real problem-causing animal, and it's not so simple when we declare problem animals. It is a massive process that we have to follow. There's normally it's a submission that goes all the way up to the minister. Only the minister can, in our case, only the minister can approve the declaration or the lethal destruction of a problem animal. But this is always, it takes a lot of time. If you can imagine, it's a submission that goes all the way to the minister, and problem animals, it is a problem that needs to be addressed with immediate effect. And so there are plans in the policy, in the current policy, to try and delegate that authority down to another level, in order to ensure a quicker response when it comes to the declaration of problem animals. The other strategy that we use is, you know, we implement mitigation measures. Mitigation measures there's so many that we have done already. Just to name a few, we collar elephants, we collar lions, we collar hyenas to try and determine where, you know, what areas are they frequenting and so forth. We build predator-proof kraals, we crocodile enclosures and so forth. So there are various mitigation measures that we do, and they have been effective over the past few years.
I might have a quick follow-up for you, Richard,
Sorry?
if you don't mind. I have a quick follow-up question to ask you, is that okay? I just wanted to ask, Namibia's actually reviewed its human-wildlife conflict policy. So you had the first one in 2009,
Yes.
and then the second one came in 2018, and since so few countries have human-wildlife conflict policies, and a number are developing, I wondered if you could tell us what is one thing that you'd say you learned through the review and development of the new policy?
Okay, so one thing that we have learned with the policy is in the previous policy there was quite a few grey areas there that were not covered. Grey areas, I'm talking about. Okay, I'm first going to talk about the self-reliance scheme. We've got a system, and I don't want to use the word compensation over here because compensation, as we don't use the word that, we use an offset system, and one of we offset losses for destruction of loss of life, destruction of crops, and so forth. So those areas have been addressed. We've increased those amounts because the amounts in the previous policy were too low, so we have managed to increase those amounts. Then other grey areas that we have covered in the policy is human wildlife conflict changes all the time. It's not cast in stone, so we have to always be, you know, to give an example we in the current policy it says that we do not cover, you know, people that graze in a specifically wildlife, where the exclusive wildlife area. But people have to move you know, because of climate change and drought and so forth. So they move into these areas where, you know, where the grazing is better for their livestock. So, and although the current policy says we do not pay that, we have to try and address those issues because of climate change and so forth. So, yeah, so we have to continuously, just to come back to the self-reliance scheme, the self-reliance scheme is funded completely through, it doesn't come out of central government coffers. It comes out of the Game Products Trust Fund. The Game Products Trust Fund is funded again through trophy hunting in national parks, park entry gate fees, and also tourism concessions in national parks. So the money that is generated through those gets paid into this Game Products Trust Fund so that we can, you know, pay the people for human-wildlife conflict. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Richard, and then we'll be able to hopefully fit in a couple of questions. But you can see how much expertise and knowledge Richard has on policy, so if you see him throughout the conference, you can go up and ask a few more questions. But our final speaker now, we are going to jump to Steve, who is going to show a couple of slides. I'll give you the clicker, Steve. And I just have one question for you, Steve, and that is, can you describe the policy context within which human-wildlife conflict is managed in Canada, and how does it differ between protected areas and outside of protected areas?
Sure, thanks very much, Lisa. So just to give the quick global context for everybody, Canada is a very large country, second largest country in the world in terms of area, but quite lightly populated. 39.5 million people, most of which are spread across the southern portion of the country, close to the United States. We have incredible geographic differences across the country as well. We've got temperate rainforests, we've got Arctic tundra, we've got large swaths of boreal forest and plains and prairies, and so all the various wildlife that changes in those locations as well. The way our country is divided up is into 10 provinces and 3 northern territories. So those 13 jurisdictions have a great deal of autonomy with respect to how they govern and manage their day-to-day affairs, and that includes things like healthcare, but all of natural resource management is done on a provincial or territorial level. So anything like forestry or mining or oil and gas development, and most importantly for this conversation, all the wildlife management and wildlife-human conflict mitigation is done at a provincial level. And some things that are critical to HWC success are actually under municipal or town or city authority. And a really good example of that would be how they manage garbage or trash, which is a big issue for a lot of species, including all 3 of the bear species that we have in Canada: black bears, brown bears, and polar bears. So all the provinces and territories have quite strong reactive programs with respect to HWC. They certainly respond to incidents, but their proactive programs vary quite a bit from province to province. None of them have, to the best of my knowledge anyways, I'm certainly not aware, have a broad overhead HWC policy per se, but they have some excellent examples of preventative work that they do at the provincial level, and some provinces have, again, back to the bear issue, what will be called a bear smart or bear aware or bear wise. They're all just different provincial terms for these proactive programs for keeping municipalities safe and secure from bears and sometimes other wildlife species. And they'll get a designation of being, a bear smart community if they meet certain criteria. So on the national scale, we have no HWC policy whatsoever that provides guidance or authority to any of the provinces or territories. We've obviously got national oversight with things like our biodiversity strategy, our alien invasive species strategy. We've already mentioned a lot about, COP15 and Target 4. I won't get back into that. We're clearly a signatory there. The one exception with national oversight is within our national park system, and that's, I work for the Parks Canada agency, so that's all the areas in green that you see on the map there are the national parks in Canada. And I'll be talking tomorrow a little bit more about the development of our national HWC strategy and the policy there. But just very quickly, I would say that, all of the HWC management that we're able to do in the national parks flows out of our National Parks Act and regulations, which has a very strong mandate that focuses and requires us to maintain or restore ecological integrity as a first priority. So it all stems from that. And the last piece I wanted to show just quickly was a diagram, and I apologize for everything that's on the screen there. You don't have to look at all of it. All I wanted you to be aware of there is if you look at the left side of the screen, you can see it starts with strategies and policies at that real upper high level, and it flows down through a bunch. And this is just all our internal vernacular within our agency as we're developing this policy, but goes down in the bottom into all the various tools. So the things that staff members and people, stakeholders are using on the ground, the best management practices, the protocols and policies and procedures. And I like to think of all of that as sort of an overall policy suite. So often, when we say the word policy in our agency, we kind of differentiate. Are we talking about big capital P policy, like an actual policy at the very top of the diagram, or are we just talking about policy more holistically? And the reason I bring that up is I think, almost everywhere in the province and territories, they've all got really strong pieces at the bottom of that diagram, often with protocols and SOPs and things like that. And you don't always have to have that higher level policy in place first. You can almost do it a little bit backwards. In a best case scenario, you'd have that high level policy, everything would flow down from there in a logical manner, but you can drive it up from the bottom with the grassroots. And then I guess finally the last thing I would mention with respect to your question there, Lisa, is the key differences on the landscape between the provinces and territories and national parks. And I often get a hard time from my provincial colleagues that we've got it easy in national parks, and in some ways we do, because we don't have to deal with forestry and mining and oil and gas development in any of the towns and cities that are within our national parks. We have complete authority over, we manage them through our federal agency. By and large, we don't have any hunting. We have some indigenous harvest in some of our northern parks, but we don't have any recreational hunting. So we're able to manage things, I think, a lot easier than many of the provinces and territories are able to.
Thank you, Steve, and I think that was a great presentation to finish us off, and I think we've seen the complexity. Yes, thank you. I think we've seen the complexity of the policy landscape, I call it, but then maybe I should also call it policy seascape. The policy landscape or seascape that applies to human-wildlife conflict. So we have perhaps time for just one or two quick questions, if anyone has one. First hand up, I see right here. Here comes the microphone, and then we have one over here second.
Thank you for your talk. It was very, very interesting. I wanted to ask, from countries who do pay compensation for loss of agriculture, crops, or wildlife, do you expect the stakeholders who reported to have implemented some measures to reduce those damages before you approve the compensation?
Do you want to come in on this one, Richard?
Yes, yeah, no, we do have measures in place. We've got, it's a long process that they go through. There has to be an investigation done. They have to fill in a claim form for that. It normally goes through a review panel. In a conservancy setup, it will go through a review panel. If it's outside a conservancy, the ministry will investigate these cases and subsequently fill in claim forms which get submitted to our office. There's another process of going through the claims, approving them at director level, and then it goes in for payment. But yeah, it is actually a paperwork, it's a paper nightmare, that one. But we push through, yeah. So we've got all the necessary things in place to make sure that there's no corruption or anything funny about it, yeah.
Thank you. And I think our second question was over here. Yes, please go ahead, sir.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentations and the explanations. I represent Brazil's Environmental Ministry, and we have a hard time to try to put up policies that will last over government if we don't have a sequence of government. And recently we have a super drastic shift in environmental policies, and when you talk about the specific matters like the human-wildlife conflict that goes to something that it's a point, I would like to ask how I saw like the scheme for the framework for the Canadian system, it seems logical, but how can we make this last over governments, over terms? Because this is it's like a very strong challenge we have to go from one government to another.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think we're lucky in Canada. We do swing back and forth between sort of a more middle of the road government and a more right-wing government. It seems like about every 10 years or so, but our public service is somewhat separated from that. So there will be, some high-level things that will certainly come down, and it seems to affect more, oil and gas development, those big sort of issues like that. And it doesn't impact us too much in national parks. So I'm not the right one to answer that question on a higher level in terms of the government, but we do have a level of removal from directly from our government's main cabinet decisions.
Thank you. And we are at time, so we are going to finish off because I hear there's a reception for everyone to get to, but I'm going to close by going to do a rapid fire, gentlemen, down the panel, and given your expertise in developing national policies, I want to ask you, what one piece of advice in just a few words would you give to any countries out there that are considering developing a human-wildlife conflict policy? So we're going to start with you, Richard.
Okay, so my advice over here is do not do it in isolation. Do not do it. That policy will fail, trust me. You have to involve as many people as possible, all stakeholders, from government, NGOs, private sector, communities. Involve as many people as you can, because then you get their buy-in. That's all I have to say on that. Thanks.
Rakesh.
Yeah. I think Richard has answered on my part also. It should be a consultative process when we try to develop a policy, not only just human-wildlife conflict, but other policies as well. And in India, we did so, and we also, we have a National Wildlife Board, National Board for Wildlife. So one of the advisories which we developed, we got approval from that highest body, which comprises of not only just officials, but also experts and scientific institutions. So it has to be a very highly consultative process when we develop policy on human-wildlife conflicts.
I would say don't be afraid to pick off some of the low-hanging fruit, the small stuff at the bottom, and go about it in a somewhat backwards manner. You can drive change, in a grassroots way. If you're waiting for that policy to come from the top always and flow down, you might be waiting forever, but it's amazing what you can do if you try and drive it from the ground up.
Thank you, and that closes our session. With that brilliant advice. Thank you everyone for joining us on this topic. If you want to know more about Global Wildlife Program, there's our website. We will be releasing the data we showed on policies in the coming months, so look out for that. Thank you again everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening.